with You Can't Yell at the Deaf Girl with my weekly conversation on Thursdays at 11. So this week, kind of a tender subject for me. Last week I was having a rough time with some triggering emotions and stuff. But before I get too much further, I wanted to just remind you to go ahead and subscribe and head over to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, and like my pages, show me some love, and leave me some comments and feedback. So I always love to hear from people who are watching and participating in my conversation. And also, if this is your first time joining us for Thursdays at 11, a little background on me and You Can't Yell at the Deaf Girl. I am someone with a profound hearing loss, and I have dealt with all sorts of issues with communication over my personal and professional life in a variety of ways. And I put a snarky in some of my responses, which is where You Can't Yell at the Deaf Girl come from. When people would honk at me or yell at me from across the room or try to get my attention, I'd be like, hey, you can't yell at the deaf girl. So really that's just kind of my smart-ass take on responding to people who don't make the effort to get your attention in a very nice way. And so that's where that's at. But my mission with this platform is to bridge the gap between bad communication and good communication. It's not so much about how well you hear, it's about how well you receive it and deliver it. There is always, always, always a way to communicate with someone. Always. And it doesn't matter how well you hear. In fact, 93% of communication is nonverbal anyways, and only 7% is what comes out of your mouth or goes into your ears. So think about that for a minute. So the majority of the way we communicate has nothing to do with how well we hear. So why do people make it such a big deal? So that's my goal there. But anyways, back to today. My conversation today is going to be a little bit about some experiences I had last week. I was at lunch with a really good friend of mine, and it seemed like every time he would bring something up, I would get teary-eyed. And I was talking about, things happening with my ex-husband and stuff like that, and just little things that were just triggering me in like a weird way, and then things with my kids, and things with my friends, and yada yada yada. It was just one trigger after another on a variety of levels, and quite frankly it was surprising to me because some of the things that I was getting triggered over I thought I had handled. I'm going through therapy. Yes, I do therapy because I do have some therapy that I need to do here, but going through therapy and going through those conversations with people, I felt like I was in a pretty good space that I was dealing with it, but apparently the back part of my brain was saying, oh yeah, oh hell no, you're not done. You still got shit you need to deal with. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about triggers today and what they do. And triggers are not always about PTSD or anything like that. Now keep in mind I am not an expert on this, but I have read about it, I have done my research, and I do have some pretty good friends who have filled me in on some of these gaps. So just know that this is in no way, shape, or form a professional opinion, but this is my opinion and how I feel about it. And I have done my research on and I also experienced them quite a bit, so I kind of sort of know what I'm talking about when I come to this, at least on a personal level. So what is a trigger exactly anyways? In psychology, triggers are considered a stimulus or stimulated by something like a smell, a sight, or a sound that triggers those feelings of trauma or that fight or flight or that anxiety. People often use the triggers for describing PTSD, and that's definitely a case there as well, but on a bigger scale, more intense feeling in a lot of ways. So what is a trigger exactly? It's a reminder of a past trauma. These can cause a person to feel overwhelming sadness, anxiety, or panic, or fear, or they cause reactions that can be unexpected at times. It can also cause someone to have flashbacks. A flashback is often a vivid, negative memory that might appear without warning. It just comes up. And a flashback will sometimes cause a person to lose track of their surroundings and then relive that traumatic event. Triggers take many forms. They might be a physical location or the anniversary of an event. It can be triggered by an internal process, such as stress, and sometimes triggers are predictable. For instance, you'll notice that a lot of veterans don't watch violent movies or movies that are about war because it brings up those memories from when they were involved in that. And then there's also other cases where triggers are less intuitive. A person who smelled incense or some kind of candle or smell or saw something during a traumatic event for them, like a sexual assault, might have a panic attack when they either smell that same smell, the same incense, or the same candle, or see that same color or something when they walk into a store or someplace like that. Or it doesn't matter really where they are if that smell comes up. People often use triggers in the context of other mental health concerns as well, such as substance abuse and anxiety. In these cases, like for example, and even with mental health illnesses like autism and stuff like that, and I can use my son as an example of that. But in these cases, a trigger can be a cue that prompts an increase in symptoms. For example, someone who is recovering from anorexia might be triggered by photos of thin celebrities, and they want to see these. They see these photos, and they might want to starve themselves again or have that urge because they're thinking they're not that thin, and we all know that's not healthy. And that most of the time, when we see those really extremely thin celebrities, they're not exactly doing it healthy either. But when you have somebody who's got that mental health concern, it doesn't always register that way. So how is a trigger formed anyway? It's kind of an interesting thing. As I was reading through my research, getting ready for today, it's an interesting thing how they're formed. The exact brain functioning behind a trigger is not really understood, but there are several theories about it. And these are the interesting ones. The majority of the time, your triggers are going to come from a fight or flight response, meaning your body's on high alert and it's prioritizing all of its resources to react to the situation. So that your functions that don't really matter at the moment or are necessary for the survival will be put on hold. That can be something like digestion or weird little things like that. And one of the functions neglected during a fight or flight situation, as per what I've been reading, is short-term memory formation. In some cases, the person's brain may misfile the traumatic event in its memory storage, and rather than being stored as a past event, the situation put into this still present is always their place, so it's always a constant threat. So when the person's reminded of the trauma or something comes up, a smell, a sound, or something, the body starts reacting as if the event is still happening, completely putting them back into that fight or flight mode, which creates a lot of anxiety for people because sometimes they don't see it coming, and it's a reaction, and other people around them don't know how to handle that, especially if they're not aware of the trauma that's occurred in this person's life. Another theory that makes triggers so powerful is because they often involve senses, as I mentioned prior: smells, sights, feelings. For me, there's been the war. There's some things that happened to me in my childhood. I was assaulted by a family member when I was quite young for quite a few years, and his bedspread was this really rough cottony feel, and so anytime I feel that rough cotton, it kind of just makes me tense up. And so that's a sensory trigger. And smells will do the same thing, just like I mentioned, the smell of an incense, the smell of a candle, or the colors. You see color red or color blue. Sometimes you just don't like something because you were in a situation where you recalled something that happened that way. And so during a traumatic event, your brain will often ingrain those sensory stimuli into the memory, and not so much into your short term, but into the present stuff. So it's always happening, and it associates it with that trauma all the time. And it can even be a habitual type of formation too that plays a strong role in triggering. people tend to do the same things the same way, following the same patterns, and save the brain from having to make decisions. I mean, that can be something like every time you get into the car, you light up a cigarette and you're quitting smoking, but your body is still so used to doing that you keep doing that. And it's not a conscious connection. If they don't make a conscious connection between the behavior and the surroundings, sometimes that trigger will just keep happening. It's quite interesting. I mean, there's so many things that go along with trigger warnings that it's just, it's quite, what I'm talking about today is going to be short and sweet, but just to kind of give you that. And, we'll talk a little bit more about my situation here in just a second. So what are the trigger warnings? Sometimes a trigger warning just comes out of nowhere. It's a notice of potential triggers and future discussions or contents, and you will say to people sometimes, hey, we're going to be talking about a certain sexual assault or domestic violence, or there's going to be flashing lights, or there's going to be these kind of things happening here. So if you're triggered by these kind of things, you're able to walk into the situation and be ready. And recently, there's a lot of students that have requested trigger warnings in school because of things that might be happening at home, and that's a variety of things for a lot of students. I mean, especially if you have a child who comes out of a home that's extremely volatile, parents are fighting all the time, and then you get to class and you've got a loud teacher who boomed, maybe not so much yelled, that could be triggering for a child and create stress. And in that situation, they don't often do well because they're always feeling this pressure and this anxiety from the loudness of the situation. And that can be hard for them. People, and interestingly enough, people oppose trigger warning because we feel like we're being overly sensitive, we're catering to overly sensitive students or people, which I think is just bullshit, to be honest. And sometimes they feel like trigger warning might promote censorship, or they infringe on a teacher's ability to teach course material. I don't think it's really a case of that. It's a matter of saying, hey, I'm going to be speaking about this. Be ready. And if something happens, you can adjust. I mean, that doesn't mean the conversation doesn't have to happen, but definitely the person that's delivering the stuff who may have triggered somebody can adjust or back off for a minute and redirect. It's pretty simple. Triggers cause, so many different things. Like for me, as I was sitting there with my friend at lunch, and he was asking me questions, that I would just be like, I don't think I answered one question that day without some kind of tears in my eyes, because we were talking about things going on, with my ex-husband and the way our child is reacting to some of these, and the way the things that my child does that remind me of certain things. It's like a constant thing for me. And it was interesting because I've spent a lot of time and effort and getting some good therapy and working through those, including talking to this friend of mine who's great at walking me through all of these. But it's just been interesting for me that the things that I thought I was doing to work through those triggers were coming back up, like roaring back up. And so it doesn't necessarily mean I have more work to do. It just means I need to be more conscious of what's happening in my world for that fight or flight. When you come out of a narcissistic situation, you start to question everything all the time, and you don't know if you've got red flags or red roses or butterflies and Skittles and all of those things. You start not to trust those internal feelings, and so that you're constantly in a heightened state of awareness. So for me, with triggers, it's just thinking back to the things that were said, the things that were done, and how there was, and that voice that's always there. It's pretty interesting on how that works sometimes. Triggers are so distressing if they come as a surprise, and that's what was happening for me last week when I was sitting there having this conversation, and all of a sudden he asked me a question, and all of a sudden these tears start coming, and I just felt myself tense up, and I thought, oh my God, are you serious? It's honestly, trigger warnings, and when people have conversations with the people and that might be a sensitive subject, being able to provide a trigger warning, and sometimes you don't know if you're going to have to or not, but there's ways to let somebody know that they can feel safe in the conversation or safe in the situation, especially if you know you've been through something. If they don't know you've been through something, then it's kind of hard to do that. But if you recognize that there's a trigger going on, if you can tell when somebody's having an anxiety attack, usually a panic attack, or it's just the way the situation, their facial, everything changes. And you can kind of go, okay, let's walk this back. What do I need to do? And ask the questions. And that's where the effort and the empathy and the compassion comes in, because you want to make sure that as you're communicating to somebody, you don't push them into fight or flight mode. Even if you're having a difficult conversation and you're having to talk about things that may not be nice to a certain extent, especially if you're you're a boss and you're having a conversation with an employee and you're having to question their behavior or things going like that. The empathy and the compassion come in because you're asking them, help me understand why you're behaving like this. And once you understand, then you can make your decisions that way, because oftentimes if you understand why the behavior is happening, you can sometimes adjust things so that they feel a little safer. Sometimes you can, and sometimes termination is the only answer. But sometimes if you understand, and you can create that sense of, I'm interested in this and helping you be successful in class, in work, in life, or whatever that is, that's huge. And just like, when we're having the trauma-informed anything, your therapist or whatever, I know my therapist does it to me all the time. She'll approach things like, well, let's talk about this, and this is how I'm going to phrase this, because I know you've mentioned to me in the past these things have happened. So if you think about it, if you approach a situation where you're actually taking that trauma or the idea of the trauma or the idea of the triggers in mind, you're going to have a better conversation, because every single one of us has a trigger of some sort. We don't know what it is sometimes, and sometimes we don't even realize we have it until all of a sudden we're going, wait, where did that come from? Or we do know we have it and we just avoid the situation to begin with. So what I'm trying to say here is, anytime you have a trigger, it does not mean that you have a mental illness. What it means is you have trauma. And if you have trauma, you owe it to yourself to find out how you can move past it. Trauma is not meant to hold you back, and trauma is not meant to make your life more difficult at all. What trauma does mean that you've been through some shit. And those of us who've been through domestic violence or the sexual assault or any of like that, and in my case, additionally add the hearing thing on that, because I've had people literally jump in front of me and be complete assholes to me because they think it's funny that I can't hear and don't scare easily because I don't hear them behind me. And so they'll do things that completely just come. So me walking into a dark room is completely traumatic for me, because I've had people do some pretty shitty things in a dark room because they think it's funny. I've also been in situations where I've had people try to mouth things to me with me reading their lips, and then they make communication hard for me because they think it's funny. And that's traumatic for me, because that's not an effort I want anyone to make for anyone, regardless of how well you hear or don't. Because honestly, that's just rude. It's shit. And, that's bullying, to be honest with you. So, and bullying someone can create that, the victim of the bullying, that creates trauma for them and their own relationships. So anytime we go through any kind of traumatic situation, violent or not, it can be just as simple as being in the same room as somebody yelling all the time, and that's trauma. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent. What I want to say is, always make the effort to understand where somebody's coming from. If they're being triggered, try to understand why and see what you can do to resituate the environment so that they feel safe enough that they can have the conversation. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to talk about their trauma or why they're being triggered, they also need to know they feel safe in a conversation, whatever that conversation might be, or that environment, or wherever they are. And if they're not feeling safe, they're going to constantly trigger. And when you're constantly living with a trigger that's going off all the time, it is freaking stressful as hell. And you don't know which way to turn. And you start to not trust yourself or your instincts. And that's a really crap place to be. At least that was my situation for a while. Anyways, that's it for today. Thursdays at 11 conversation. Kind of a heavy conversation today, but one worth having and one worth considering. It is not always an issue or people being difficult to communicate with that makes them difficult to communicate with. So again, the effort and communication lies with you, no matter what, with the empathy and the compassion. It's always about effort and time. Always. So, again, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, shoot me a comment if you'd like, and I will see you next week at 11 on Thursday. Have a great day, and don't forget to make good choices.